An American-Israeli breakup is inevitable. In light of recent events, that statement might come off a bit strange. After all, at the time of writing this, Trump has launched an air campaign against the Houthis. Israel is escalating its war against Hezbollah and Hamas and maybe even Syria, seemingly with US support. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has gone on record defending the deportation of resident aliens with anti-Israeli views. And who could forget Trump trying to annex the Gaza Strip and expelling the Palestinians from the region? Well, things are a bit more complicated than they seem, and in the case of what's to become of Gaza, as I predicted 1 month ago, Trump's language has proven to have been just a mere negotiation strategy, as well as partially misunderstood by the media and the public. In terms of the grander dynamic between the US and Israel, what we're seeing shape up not only as a result of recent conflict in the region or recent discussions from American politicians, but clear long-term trends which have been churning for decades by this point, is an inevitable break in the US-Israeli alliance. Hello audience, Mr. Z here. It's been a while since I did a video with the inevitable intro, but after calling thing after thing after thing and having them manifest all these years later, I figure why not take a crack at another prediction in the same way I used to all those years ago. I'm actually joined today by my buddy Arthur Greenwood, who's got some great political content over on his channel, and if you happen to be new to our channel, welcome. I'm Mr. Z. I discuss history and politics every week, so be sure to subscribe and tune in for more. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can always donate to us on Patreon, follow us on X or Instagram. I'm actually speaking to you right now through a new microphone I bought using fan funding. So every little bit that you contribute really does help make the channel better. We've also got a second channel dedicated to alternate history, so feel free to check that out if you're wondering where to find the very best of the stuff on the platform. Now, the US-Israeli alliance at a glance was really a product of Cold War pragmatism. The US had a history of loosely supporting Zionism previously, but Britain, as the global hegemon, was the primary activist in this field until the end of World War II, and the motivations behind Britain's actions were oddly reminiscent of those which would later develop within the United States, one part ideological and another part strategic. The Middle East, given its close proximity to the Soviet Union, its ability to act as an alternative route into the Mediterranean, and its valuable supply of petroleum, which was becoming increasingly necessary to fuel the industry, transportation, and war machines of the superpowers, had grown into a region of great interest for, of course, both superpowers. Recognition of Israel was granted by the United States through President Truman on his own moral and ideological grounds, having sympathized with the Jewish people and argued they deserve a homeland to feel secure in following the tumultuous Second Great War. Though of course domestic lobbying groups did play a role in this decision as well, but by this point it was more about bringing the matter to the president's attention than making a demand. Believe it or not, it was initially the Soviets, not the Americans, attempting to court the Israelis. The US had actually placed an arms embargo upon Israel and was attempting to court various Arab states which were previously tied to France and Britain's empires, seeing them as potentially receptive to Western partnership under independent governments. Developments within the Middle Eastern countries, however, would reveal the reality of things, as the Israelis, despite their initial pro-socialist government, favored integration with the democratic West, whereas various Arab states began developing their own brand of socialism rooted in a sense of secular Arab nationalism and authoritarian ideology which placed them more in alignment with the Soviets. There also remained a lingering sense among the Arabs that the countries of the West might attempt to once again subjugate them, giving the Soviets an edge in framing themselves as an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist ally. Initially, it may have appeared as though the Cold War divide in the Middle East would have been between US-backed monarchies and Soviet-backed Ba'athist republics, but as hostilities continued breaking out between Israel and its neighbors over nationalistic clashes, with Israel repeatedly emerging victorious, the United States grew more invested in this promising military power. Following the Six-Day War, during which the Israelis beat back the Egyptian and Syrian Baathists as well as the Jordanian monarchy, the US began its heavy supply of military aid to Israel, who gradually grew accustomed to American support. The pragmatic relationship had been established, but it would soon be supplanted by something much stronger. The post-war period had borne witness to an astonishing rise in America's evangelical population, and with them grew an impending sense of the end times. After all, with two superpowers wielding weapons everyone believed could end the world, it appeared as though biblical prophecy was coming true, and at the center of it all was the Holy Land coming under the control of the Jews. Even before Israel's establishment, evangelical Americans had seen Zionism as a tool for fulfilling biblical prophecy, and now with it established and evangelical numbers on the rise, that sentiment grew even more. Simultaneously, the Israelis were taking a proactive approach to shoring up support from the superpower of the West through the use of lobbying groups, from the Conference of Presidents to the Zionist Organization of America, but probably the most successful of all was AIPAC, which today has become the most influential organization of its kind, lobbying as many members of Congress as possible in the pursuit of policy that is aligned with Israel's interests, and utilizing their network to build a pro-Israeli outlook for the United States. The Reagan administration would prove a tremendous springboard for the alliance as the president harnessed both an appeal to evangelical America as well as a more interventionist approach to foreign policy, which made this little Middle Eastern country appear as a model partner. All factors considered, it's no wonder America had become as infatuated with Israel as it had. But by the time the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War came to an end, the relationship between the United States and Israel ceased to be one of pragmatism and instead became something held together by a mix of ideological or rather religious fervor and an inability to move past a Cold War mindset. All these years later, Israel has become the largest cumulative recipient of US aid in history, having taken some $300 billion when adjusted for inflation. Though, interestingly enough, Ukraine over the course of just a few years has received more than half of that amount. Israel has translated this American aid into one of the foremost militaries in the Middle East, the most advanced of the region, as well as a high standard of living, though it's come at the cost of around a dozen direct conflicts for Israel, and because of America's non-stop support for the country, the blame Israel received from the Arab countries for bringing war and instability to the region also got tied to the United States. Regardless of whether or not these accusations were made in good faith, America now earned the ire of several countries and communities which may have otherwise had no opinion of the US one way or another. As a matter of fact, the perspective among the Arabs that the US was to blame for Israel's actions served as the motivation for the September 11th attacks by Al-Qaeda, which in turn motivated additional American interventions in the region in the form of the War on Terror, which further benefited Israel by toppling unfriendly regimes, destabilizing threatening countries, and opening the door to harsher domestic policies against the Palestinian population in the name of national security. In short, Israel benefited from turning its own enemies into America's enemies, and the US was saddled with the consequences. The post-Cold War world, much as in the case of the NATO alliance with Europe, has made America's alliance with Israel superfluous, unnecessary, and arguably even detrimental to America's domestic interests, bringing the US new expenditures, new enemies, and new conflicts it would not have had otherwise. Many on the Israeli side will try to justify this and argue that Israel contributes much to the US, that Israel is America's largest offshore military base, that Israel provides the US with valuable intelligence on foreign adversaries through the use of Mossad, that the two share data on tech and weapons development, as well as the country serving to guard oil and trade goods traveling across the Suez and the East Mediterranean. In all these circumstances, however, Israel remains the chief benefactor, or the reason the US would have had that need to fill in the first place. Firstly, the US would not need a large military presence in the region if not for Israel making its enemies into America's enemies. Secondly, intelligence on the countries of the region certainly serves more to protect Israeli security than American security, which once again is only compromised because the US has tied itself to Israel and adopted its rivals. It must also be stated that Israel is guilty of having turned its intelligence apparatus against the US on at least a few occasions, including in one publicized potential incident against President Donald Trump during his first term. Thirdly, the argument of shared tech development is probably the strongest, but still Israel is reaping the cream of the crop here. There's no reason the US could not divert this funding to domestic weapons and technology research. Finally, as the United States moves away from foreign dependencies and more towards self-sufficiency, there is no longer a need to have Israel act as a resource guardian in the region save for its own benefit and the stability of its geopolitical neighborhood. The simple reality is that, again, like the alliance with Western Europe, the alliance with Israel is no longer practical, and Americans are realizing that more and more. Even culturally, some argue there is an unbreakable connection between the two rooted in Judeo-Christian values, but much as in the case of those who argue America is tied to European geopolitics by shared European heritage and democratic values, this is based in an ideological idealism, not geopolitical reality. Even insofar as ideological idealism, it's not one based in sound theory, for the fact that Israel is not a remarkably religious country, with only some 20% of the country being strongly religious in the Jewish faith, and nearly half the country being explicitly secular. First and foremost, Israel is rooted in ethnic Jewish identity, religious Jewish identity being secondary to that, eroding the foundation of an alliance built on shared religious values. Even then, the concept of Judeo-Christian values is very much a modern idea which tries to force the two into a common mold. By similar logic, one might even argue that Islamo-Jewish values might exist because they're both rooted in Abrahamic tradition, but at that point, why not just say Abrahamic values? Whatever term is used, be it Abrahamic values or Judeo-Christian values, this is a very broad term that does not provide adequate basis for alliance. The US and Iran share Abrahamic values. Russia and Saudi Arabia share Abrahamic values. That doesn't mean they're particularly alike or have shared geopolitical interests.
The simple fact is that Israel no longer has the support of the American people. A Gallup poll from March 6 found that public sympathy for Israel is at an all-time low, with only 46% of Americans supporting Israel. That still sounds like a fairly large percentage, but this is the first time that number has dropped below 50%. And if current trends continue, it will only fall farther during the coming years. Of course, America is not a direct democracy, so public opinion does not necessarily result in policy changes. But politicians still need votes. As Israel becomes more and more unpopular, generation after generation, politicians will face pressure to cut ties with Israel, or at least to pull back military and financial support. Young Americans are not willing to die for Israel. If Iran decides to attack Tel Aviv in 15 years, any politician who puts boots on the ground to defend our greatest ally will be deeply, deeply unpopular. So public opinion does matter, and we have to ask, why are the American people turning away from Israel? There's a lot going on here, but I think the biggest factor is the decline of the boomers. Baby boomers grew up in a world defined by the post-war liberal consensus. The previous generation had served in World War II, either on the ground or on the home front, and had witnessed the horrors and destruction of the war firsthand. The unifying zeitgeist of the time can be defined in two words: never again. Freedom, democracy, and tolerance were the core values of the post-war liberal order. Because of this, it's understandable that boomers have a deep affection for the state of Israel. Israel was sold to the world as a guarantee that the Holocaust would never happen again. The pitch was that Jewish people deserved their own sovereign land, where they could be safe from anti-Semitic pogroms and regimes. But the boomer support for Israel is not merely political. It is religious. Evangelical Zionism, a movement which became widespread, especially among the Baptist Christians of the South, saw the re-establishment of Israel as ordained by God. And within premillennial theology, it is believed that Israel must be supported so that Christ can return. So, for many evangelical boomers, supporting Israel is an article of faith, and not supporting Israel is tantamount to heresy. Among younger Americans, however, this belief is not so common, as a growing number of millennials and Zoomers reject religion altogether. Among those who are religious, many have turned away from evangelicalism to other Christian denominations, most notably the Catholic Church, which does not have a tradition of religious Zionism and has often been quite critical of Israel. Only 32% of Catholics support Israel, the smallest percentage out of all Christian denominations. Polls have repeatedly found that younger Americans are much less likely to support Israel. To be clear, this is not just because younger people are more liberal. Even among young Republicans, only 28% support Israel, compared to 70% of Republicans over 65. This is probably because of movements like America First and an online resurgence of the old right, which favors non-interventionism or at least a significant reduction of foreign aid. Conservative commentators like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson have been openly critical of Israel, something we would never have seen 10 years ago. Even Matt Walsh has openly called for America to cut off all aid to Israel. The failure of neocon foreign policy has become incredibly obvious, so even conservatives are very skeptical of the wars in the Middle East. This has led many to turn a critical eye on the ally that brought us into those wars. It used to be, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. In 2016, when Trump called the war in Iraq a big fat mistake, he was nearly booed off the stage. But today, the dialectic has advanced. Conservatives are not afraid to criticize America's allies, and even to defend America's so-called enemies. Take Assad, for instance. 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkably taboo to defend him in Republican circles. He was a staunch enemy of Israel. He funded Hamas and Hezbollah. But if you look around today, major figures from Tucker to Michael Knowles to Tulsi Gabbard have said that Assad was a net positive, that he protected Christians and maintained stability. Conservatives are realizing that just because Assad was an enemy of Israel does not make him an enemy of ours. The times are changing, not only among Republicans, but also among Democrats. Historically, the Democratic Party viewed Israel as a bastion of liberal democracy, a beacon of feminism and gay rights in the Middle East. But in February 2023, Democrat sympathy for Israel dropped to 38%, while sympathy for Palestine jumped to 49%. marking the first time that pro-Palestine leanings got the upper hand in the party base. The future of American politics is difficult to predict, but one thing is clear. We are on the precipice of a new era. Whether that era is defined by radical Trump-inspired nationalism or by radically leftist socialism, it is very likely that the American-Israeli alliance will become a relic of the past.
Much like Europe, Israel holds diverging interests from the US, and the alliance between the two simply is not sustainable. I spoke about this as well in my Europe video, that an alliance is like a relationship. It must be practical and it cannot be one-sided, and plainly the alliance between the US and Israel is not geopolitically practical and has been overwhelmingly characterized by the US providing for Israel. Now, American politicians have been increasingly discussing a pivot toward China, and a key facet of Trump's administration since his first term has been to end what he calls forever wars, most of which, any American might tell you, are tied to the Middle East. Peace in the region has been a major driver for Trump. He considers the Abraham Accords one of his proudest achievements, and it's likely less something motivated by Trump's personal favoritism toward Israel and more a recognition of how draining this part of the world is for the US. So what's this all mean for the future of the US and Israel? As Arthur brought up, as the older generation ages out and the younger generation gains in political power, whether on the right or the left, you will see a surge in Israel skepticism among the American electorate. Association with groups like AIPAC will likely become more of a liability than an asset, as the public begins associating the group and others with foreign allegiance. The Israelis in turn are going to need to reconcile with a world in which they cannot depend upon the United States for support. By this point in time, they've come far enough to stand on their own 2 feet. As stated previously, they boast the most advanced military in their domain and hold at their disposal a nuclear arsenal which could potentially rival China's, though the details are murky. On top of that, virtually every major threat to Israel in its immediate vicinity has been eradicated or neutralized. While once all of its neighbors sought its destruction, now Egypt and Jordan and maybe even Syria are regarded as friendly. Though that being said, Israel isn't without enemies. Outside of non-state actors, Iran is who comes to mind for most when considering Israel's adversaries. However, the result of the Iran-Israeli proxy conflict doesn't paint a picture of Iranian capability to effectively challenge Israel, and it might be expected that Iran will be pressured into standing down by nearby Russia given recent discussions between Trump and Putin. The greater threat to Israel's security may actually lay to the north in the form of Turkey. The Turks, though not as militarily advanced as the Israelis, likely possess in terms of raw power the most formidable military in the region and have made no mystery of their displeasure with Israel. Turkey's president has referred to Israel as a terror state, has severed diplomatic relations with the country in 2024, and even suggested that Israel's invasion of Lebanon was provoking war with Turkey. It's difficult to say precisely what might lead the two into a violent conflict down the line, but almost certainly a rivalry could be expected to emerge between the two, possibly seeing Iran and Turkey partner up, with Iran assuming a role as a junior partner. For all Israel has at its disposal, facing off against Iran and Turkey at the same time may prove difficult, but it's quite possible that of all the countries they may forge an alliance with, India could be their top contender. Strategically, India is nearby enough to share Israel's geopolitical domain without encroaching on any areas that they might have interests or ambitions upon. India, of course, is a fellow nuclear power with a massive population and a significant industrial base, both of which Israel could draw upon for support in a time of crisis. India at present is one of the largest buyers of Israeli military tech, accounting for some 42% of all Israeli arms exports, and stands to benefit from Israel's advanced tech sector, helping it grow its own, not to mention providing India a port into the Mediterranean for its exports. In recent years, India has shifted away from its partnership with Iran in favor of Israel, much to the apparent delight of the Indian population, who, given the hostility felt by many Hindus toward Muslims given India's rivalry with Pakistan, were eager to forge a new non-Islamic partner, and perhaps even a partner equally opposed to the expansion of Islamic influence. Partnership between these two countries is practical both from their geopolitical standpoints and stands to be mutually beneficial. Israel potentially acting as an economic boon and a reliable military partner, while India provides Israel added security, a potential check against Iran, and serves as a large resource and labor-rich ally. Quickly before I go, and I just had to whip out the old microphone, so you might be able to hear a little bit of a contrast between this audio and the audio I recorded earlier, I had to bring up the situation of Europe. While countries like the UK and France do have positive relations with Israel, as geopolitical realities kick in a world that's not wholly dominated and micromanaged by the United States, I'm inclined to believe that a more independent and self-focused Europe might seek to reassert its control over the Suez Canal. Partnership with Israel is certainly possible, but more likely than not this is going to be an area of contention between the two, especially if we assume the United States will reassert control over the Panama Canal as well as over the Northwest Passage. Westward shipping would become significantly more expensive, and the utilization of the Suez could only be expected to increase. Of course, is the question of whether or not Israel might turn to China of all countries. However, a major conflict of interest emerges when we consider the matter of Pakistan. Many of the countries that China is leaning on and involved in developing for the sake of its own economic growth. It's no mystery that Pakistan and Afghanistan aren't particularly fond of Israel. If China was forced into a situation where they have two conflicting allies, and they were forced to choose between one of the two, they would probably side with their pre-existing relationship with Pakistan and Afghanistan, reinforcing the likelihood of Israel turning to India as the only real alternative. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you, the viewers, think in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.